Today's daf is daf Samach Hey. And we got up to Rabbi Yehuda, Tanan Rabbi Yehuda Omer. That's what we covered up to yesterday. So we'll see where we got up to in a second. Just 1 second. Tanan Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Is approximately 10 lines down for the top. Let's just count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down from the top. Right? Where we got up to. The Gemara now is going to ask a kasha from our Mishnah on Rav. Let's go over the machlokas between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan from yesterday, so we have a safe departure today. Rav and Rabbi Yochanan debate the following question. If one of the two se'irim that were chosen dies, we have to bring another set of 2 se'irim for a second go-roll. And in the second go-roll, one of the 2 se'irim will be identical with the sa'ir that survived from the first go-roll, because only one of the 2 se'irim died. So we have 2 se'irim that are identical. And both are Lashem, let's say, if in the case where the sa'ir HaMishtalech died. Rav says that we should be makriv the first se'ir, the one that was initially designated on the first round. And Rabbi Yochanan applies a principle called Yesh Dechia B'Bali Chayim, which means that the moment that Sar Mitzalech died, the Sar Lashem of the first go-roll was nidche. It was excluded from the Mizbeach. There's no way that we can be makriv it, and therefore it's the second Seir Lashem from the second go-roll that will be makriv. Tonight we learned that Mishnah Rabbi Yehuda Omer, the second Seir is Tamus. In other words, we have now 2 Seirim, and we can't be makriv both of them. Or, for example, if the Seir Lashem died, now we have 2 Seirim Lazazel. So one of them is Tamus. And this is the unique Shita Rabbi Yehuda that we mentioned yesterday, that even in the case of a Chatos HaTzibur, we have halach of Misa. That means if that Chatos can no longer be brought on the Mizbeach, then we have to passively let it die. Now, which one of the Seirim does Rabbi Yehuda paskin Tamus? It would seem that since Rabbi Yehuda is arguing with the Chachamim, who are of the opinion that Yirayad Sheyistayev, and he says, Rabbi Yehuda, that even in the case of Chatzat Tzibur Mesa, then the one sire about which the Chachamim said Yirah is the same sire about which Rabbi Yehuda, in arguing with the Chachamim, said Tamus. Is Bishlema l'Rabbi Yochanan, the Omar Hasheni Shebezuga Rishon, Yireh. According to Rabbi Yochanan, who's of the opinion that it's the surviving sire of the first Hagrola that gets sent out to the pasture land to become a Balmum, and then we pod it, we give the money for an Indava. That is the Shita of the Chachamim. Is therefore the Rabbi Yehuda, when Rabbi Yehuda says Tamus, He's referring to that same Sa'ir about which the Chachamim said Yeroah. Is miskaper b'sheni shebezug hasheni. He will bring as a Sa'ir, Lashem, the new Sa'ir from the second Hagrola to replace the first Sa'ir, which is going to be starved to death. El Rav di Omar Sheni Shebezug Hasheni Yeroah Ul Rabbi Yehuda Yomus is that Rabbi Yehuda b'may miskaper. We're going to get into a situation of mimanavshach, according to Rav's understanding in Rabbi Yehuda, and there's going to be no sa'ir that we could actually bring, not the first nor the second. Why is that? Because according to Rav, the one sa'ir that the Chachamim said Yeroah has to be sent out to pasture land is the second sa'ir from the second Hagrola. And on that, Rabbi Yehuda says Tammuz regarding that second sa'ir. Now, as far as the first sa'ir is concerned, that also can't be brought on the Mizbeach, because the very minute that the sa'ir Mishalech died, then there's a din of dichui, and even though Rav himself says ain't dichui b'Baalei Chayim, but he admitted in the sugi that we learned yesterday on Daf Samach Daled that Rabbi Yehuda certainly maintains that there is dichui b'Baalei Chayim. So we manavshach, we're in trouble here. Neither the first sa'ir that survived amongst the two partners, nor the second sa'ir that was brought as a replacement, neither of them can be brought on the Mizbeach. The second sa'ir is the one about which Rabbi Yehuda says Tammuz, because we're assuming now that that was the one that he argued against the Chacham. The Chachamim said Yeroah, and he said, Rabbi Yehuda, Tammuz. That's on the second carbon. The sa'ir from the second Hagrola. The sa'ir from the first Hagrola is Dachui the very moment that the Mishtaleach dies. So the Gemara answers, Mi Savas Rabbi Yehuda, Asheni Shebigzug Sheni Koi. Why do you think that Rabbi Yehuda, who said Tammuz, he was talking about the sa'ir that was meant in the second Hagrola to replace the sa'ir in the first Hagrola? The sa'ir in the first Hagrola is out of the picture because of Dichud. But as far as the second sa'ir is concerned, Rabbi Yehuda Sheni Shebezuga Rishon Koi, when Rabbi Yehuda said Tammuz, he was referring to the surviving sa'ir from the first Hagrola, because he holds Baalei Chayim Nidachim, and even Chatas Atzibur, once there's Dichui, is Lemisa, and the replacement sa'ir, which was designated by the Hagrola Shniya, the second Hagrola, that's the one that could be brought on the Mizbeach. Again, admittedly, it's not so smooth because Rabbi Yehuda is not talking about the same sa'ir that the Chachamim are talking about, but it doesn't matter because there's a two-way machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Now the Gemara brings a Lishna Achrita in which the kasha from the Mishnah was on Rabbi Yochanan, not the way we just had it on Rav. Ika de kamosiv le hachi. So some have the kasha on from our Mishnah on Rabbi Yochanan. It says in our Mishnah, V'od Rabbi Yehuda, Nishpach Hadam, after the Hagrola, and they were ready for the Hazah Sadam of the Sarah Pnimi, the dam fell on the floor, and there's no longer a possibility of Hazah, is Yomi HaMishtalech. The Mishtaleach is no longer suitable, and therefore it will die. The opposite scenario, Beis HaMishtalech, it was the Sarah Mishtaleach died, Yishafech Adam, we take the dam of the Sarah Pnimi and we spill it out. We throw it in the rubbish. Again, this is all because he hadn't yet gotten a chance to be mazeh the dam of the soyer hapnimi before the soyer hamishtalech died. Vishleim Rav, according to Rav, who says that according to the Chachamim in the Reisha, they hold that ein bali chaim nidachim, and therefore the kapara will come through the soyer of the first hagrola, and the soyer from the second hagrola will go out to the pasture land. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says v'od. What does v'od mean? Since in the Reisha, at the beginning of Rabbi Yehuda's statement, pligi bechatos tzibur, if you have a chatos of the tzibur that cannot be brought on the mizbeach, Chacham say that we send it out to raya, to the pasture. Rabbi Yehuda says that even though it's a chatos tzibur, nevertheless the din is that if it's eno karv, it goes lemisa. The seifa, and now in the seifa, pligi bedin balichayim. We have an additional machlokus now in the Sefer, not about whether chatos tzibur is mesa or not, but about bali chaim nidachim or not. Chacham hold ein bali chaim nidachim, and therefore the kapara comes through the first soyer from the first hagrola. Rabbi Yehuda says no, bali chaim nidachim. And the moment that the soyer mishlech died, there was a din bichui to disqualify the soyer lashem. El Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that even the Chachamim agree that Bali Chaim Nidachim, which means the kapara always has to be from the second replacement soyer of the second agrola. So there's only one machlokas between Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda about the din of Chatas Tzibur, whether it's Mesa or Lo Mesa, is my V'od. What is Rabbi Yehuda adding with the word V'od? There was only a single issue that divided Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, and that is whether Chatas HaTzibur Roa or Mesa. And the Gemara comes to the conclusion, Kasha, that in truth the Mishnah seems to support the Shita of Ra. Now the Mishnah says, V'od Omer Rabbi Yehuda Nishpach Adam Yomus HaMishtalech. If the dam of the soyer pnimi spilled on the ground, then the mishtalech has to die. So Gemara asks the following question: Vishlema nishpach adam yomis hamishtalech. I understand why Rabbi Yehuda says that the mishtalech has to die if there's no hazah from the dam pnimi because it was nishpach, and the reason for that is the akati lo is avid mitzvah say. In other words, the matanos and azos of the dam of the soyer were not yet implemented. And therefore, since avodas matan dam is absolutely critical, it's ma'keves, he's going to have to bring a second zug, a second pair, with a second agrola. And the mishtalech is now nidche, the very moment that the dam of the soyer hapnimi was nishpach, and that's the shita Rabbi Yehuda that Bali Chaim nidachim and then for Yomos. Ella, but how? But here we have to ask a catch on the reverse scenario. What happens if meis hamishtalech amai shofech adam? Why do we have to get rid of the soyer hapnimi? Ha is avid le mitzvah say. So I'm going to read to you the translation of these words here in the Masechet. He says, "Halo kvar nasta mitzvaso shel hasoyer mishtalech shrei eina ma'akavo el hagrola kedei lekvoa lechol soyer eshmo kvar nasta bo hagrola." So what happens? There was a hagrola, and then subsequently the soyer mishtalech died, and we're saying as a result we have to disqualify the dam of the soyer pnimi. So the Gemara says that no, the mitzvah of the soyer mishtalech was already implemented because the only critical part of the mitzvah is to be kover the shame as a soyer lazaza. So immediately after the hagrola, with regard to the soyer hamishtalech, vis-a-vis that soyer, it's already considered naseis mitzvaso. And if it's naseis mitzvaso, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to use the dam and be machshir the soyer hapnimi. Why do you tell me that the dam is completely disqualified? Amri Debei Rabbi Yanai, Amar Kra, the Torah says with regard to the Soyer Mishtalech, Yamad Chai Lifnei Hashem Lechaper, Ad Mosa Yehi Zokuk, Lios Chai, Ad Shas Matan Domim Shel Chavero. Since the Soyer Mishtalech died before the Matan Domim of the Soyer Pnimi, therefore, Nidcha Adam B'Misoso. And now we're going to say that everybody agrees that this halach of dichui after the behemoth was already shechted. There was only a machlokas about Balei Chai as long as it's alive. So he needs a second pair of seirim with a hagrola because there's no kaparas hadam. The kaparas hadam only applies if and when there's Yom Chai. He needs the Soyer Mishtalech at the time of the Matan Damim. And here the Soyer Mishtalech died before the Matan Damim. Is therefore, there's no possibility of Matan Damim after the death of the Soyer Mishtalech, and Matan Damim is the essence of the Korban Apnimi. He's going to have to bring another Zug. And as far as the first Zug is concerned, everybody's going to agree that there's Dichui with regard to the Soyer Apnimi. Now we start a sugya about seirim and parim that were meant to be brought last year. Can they be brought this year, a year later? Tanan Hasa, we have a Mishnah in Shkolim, B'nei Ha'ir. If there was a city outside Yerushalayim, Sheshalchu Shikleim, they sent their Shkolim, which has to be collected annually. The Yad Shlichim, they sent to the Beis Hamikdash in the hands of agents, V'nignavu o she'avdu, on the way towards Yerushalayim. Before the Shliach was able to arrive in Yerushalayim, the monies were stolen or they got lost. It all depends at what point do we notify, we have to notify the Bailim that their monies never made it to the Lishkas Beis HaMikdash, because the Bailam would have to replace these mos. But the Mishnah says in Shkolim, im nitruma truma, in other words, there were 3 kupos in the Truma Salishka, and at some point or another, they are torem the Shkolim, they take the Shkolim out of the kupa, and they designated for the purchase of a korban tzibur. Now, once there was a Trumas Halishka, there was a Tormemes Halishka situation, then the Bailam at that point no longer have to replace the Shkolim that got lost. Why? Because at the moment that in the Mikdash, that Tormemes Halishka, they include within that Trumas Halishka any shkolim that were meant to be brought or to arrive in the Beis HaMikdash and got lost on the way. So now, if they were already Torah Es HaMishkan, Es HaTruma, before the Bailim were notified about the loss or the theft of their shkolim, it's irrelevant. As far as the Bailam are concerned, they don't lose anything. They gave their shkolim, and once the shkolim were given in this city, but there was already a Trumas Halishka in Yerushalayim, then automatically their shkolim are considered as if they arrived, even though they never really made it. Now, the loss of these shkolim is going to be suffered by the Migdash, by Hegdish. And the Gizbar is in charge of Hegdish. He's going to now litigate and sue the shliach. Why did this happen? You didn't do a good job contractually. You didn't live up to your obligations. Is nishboim like gizbarim. The shluchim have to take an oath to the gizbar, and in that oath, if they, let's assume they were shomer chinam, they weren't paid for what they did, then a shomer chinam is potter from gnei vavel. He just has to take a shvur that lo pasha. He wasn't negligent. And the Gemara about Matia asked the question, but ein nishbon al gedeshos, and the Gemara says that this shvur is a takonis chachamim kidei shelo yizalzelu b'kodshim. Now, if there was a contractual agreement with each shluchim and they're being paid, then they will not be paid until they take a shvua to the gizbarim. V'im lav. Now we have the reverse case, where the Bailam found out that their shkolim never made it, that it was stolen, and it's before the Trumas Halichka was Torem, is then they, the Bailam, will have to replace the shkolim, and therefore Nishboim, the Shluchim, have now litigation with the Bnei Ha'ir, meaning with those people whose shkolim got lost, who will now have to replace those shkolim, and the shliach will have to take a shvua to the Ben Ha'ir. Because in this case, we're not going to be torem the shkolim from the lishka unless the Bailam are willing to send a second set of shkolim to replace the first set of shkolim that never made it to the Beis Hamikdash. So now the hefsed is for the Bailam. They become what we call the Baldin. They have the status of litigants. They will sue the shluchim, and therefore the shluchim have to take a shvu to the Bailam. Now, if the Bailam found out before Trumas, they were Torah the Trumas Halichka, Bnei Ha'ir Shoklim Achreim Tachteim. So those who had sent their shkolim, and the shkolim were lost, they will have to now send a whole new set of shkolim. And Nimtzu, what happens if now we locate the first set of shkolim after the second set of shkolim was given as a replacement? Oh, it's Zira Ganovim, we tracked down, wanted dead or alive, the thief, and he gave it back. So they now have the shkolim. Elu ve'elu, both shkolim have the status of Hegdei, shkolim him, because once he was Magdashit, then they're not Yotze B'Bei Kedushasam, even though they contributed twice. But Ein Olam Lahem L'Shana Ba. They may come and say, well, look, if I gave my shekel twice, then count it on my account for next year. But we can't do that because the shkolim have to come from the new shkolim each year. So you can't use the last year's shkolim to pay up your obligation for this year. And the Brisa now quotes Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Olim Lahem L'Shana Ba. Since they gave a second set of shkolim, we found that we located the first set of shkolim, they don't have to pay this coming year. They already paid last year. My time with Rabbi Yehuda, why does Rabbi Yehuda hold that you can pay a second round this year and it could accrue to your account for next year? Omar Rava Kasavar Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that Chovos Shel Shana Zu Krevos L'Shana Ba, that if he was Mafrich Mos for his obligation of this year, he could also fulfill his obligation for next year. And here, since he gave a second round of shkolim, because he was replacing what was bein time in the meantime was lost shkolim, therefore that could accrue for next year. And in the light of this explanation of Rava to Rabbi Yehuda, Abai asks Rava the following question. Parvis Soya, we have a brisa. Yoma Kippur Sha'avdu v'hifrish achreim tachteim v'chein tziri avodat zara Sha'avdu v'hifrish achreim tachteim kulam yomusu divrei Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon Omrim yiru ad sheyistavu v'yimachru v'yiplu dmeim linen dava she'ein chatas tzibur mesa. So Rabbi Yehuda says that the Rishonim Yomusu. I mean, we see clearly that according to Rabbi Yehuda, we're not able to leave the par and soyer of this Yom Kippurim and leave it over for next year and fulfill the mitzvah of par v'sar Yom Kippurim next year. And that's against Rava's interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda, because according to Rava, Rabbi Yehuda holds that you can take the chiyuvim of this year and you can use them to fulfill your obligation of next year. So we go from one year to the other. Why don't we do the same thing in the case of par v'sar shel Yom Kippurim Avdu? We lost it, and now they were mafresh a second par or a second sar to replace them. And now they find the first par or soyer, Yamusu. Why Yamusu? Why not leave it for next year?